The rejection arrived before the vow, swift as a blade and quieter than a prayer, and in that stillness 2 lives tilted away from the future that had been promised to them. The words were spoken with ceremonial calm, shaped by duty rather than malice, yet they struck with the weight of law. He would not proceed. The church did not gasp, society had taught itself restraint. But something irreversible moved through the gathered hearts, and the young woman at the altar felt the air leave her chest as if the world had exhaled her name and found it wanting. He was a duke by inheritance and by habit, trained to measure himself by consequence. His voice, when it failed her, carried the discipline of councils and corridors, a tone refined to prevent chaos. He did not look at her as he withdrew, not from contempt but from fear, for to meet her eyes would have been to confess the weakness he had spent a lifetime denying. The choice had been shaped elsewhere, whispered in rooms where lineage outweighed mercy, where a single rumor could corrode a house. He believed he was saving something larger than himself. He did not yet understand what he was losing. She stood where she had been placed, neither pleading nor fainting, because dignity was the last possession left untouched by rumor. She had been raised to listen, to wait, to accept the judgments of men as the weather of the world, yet in that moment she learned the sound of her own resolve. The silence pressed upon her, heavy with expectation, but she did not fill it with tears. She breathed once, and felt the steadiness return. What had been arranged for her had been undone, what remained was choice. Names mattered in that England, and hers had been weighed and found suspect. A family's fall did not require proof, only repetition, and her father's misstep, political, not moral, had become a stain she carried without consent. The Duke knew this history as one knows an inconvenient truth, acknowledged, avoided, and ultimately obeyed. The marriage had been designed to mend reputations, to quiet gossip through ceremony. When the gossip grew louder, the design collapsed. The rejection was framed as prudence. It sounded, to those trained to hear it, like survival. When she moved at last, it was with care, as though every gesture were a sentence addressed to the future. She removed her gloves and placed them aside, not as surrender but as conclusion. There would be no argument, no appeal to affection spoken only in private. She offered a bow that recognized the crowd without courting it, then turned from the place where her name had been suspended between promise and refusal. Each step carried her farther from the role she had been assigned and closer to the woman she had not yet met. Behind her, the Duke felt the shape of regret forming before it had a name. He had expected relief, the easing of a pressure that had narrowed his sleep and sharpened his counsel. Instead there was a hollow, a recognition that the cost had not been evenly borne. He had exercised power, she had endured its consequence. The balance troubled him, though he could not say why, and he remained where he was, bound by the propriety that had already betrayed him. Outside the ceremony, the world resumed its murmur. Words would travel, soften, harden, acquire intention. The story would be told as caution, as necessity, as proof that order must be protected. She understood this without hearing it, for she had learned early how narratives were built upon women's silence. She would not offer herself to that construction. If her life were to be explained, it would be by her own footsteps. She left London not in disgrace but in refusal. The choice did not require spectacle, it required courage sustained beyond the moment of pain. In the countryside, she would exchange scrutiny for labor, expectation for quiet, the constant rehearsal of deference for a slower music. She did not imagine happiness as reward. She imagined peace as practice. The future, stripped of ceremony, felt uncertain and therefore honest. The Duke returned to his obligations with the efficiency expected of him. He attended, decided, agreed. Yet the absence followed him like an unanswered question. In avoiding scandal, he had preserved a name and endangered a conscience. He told himself the story would end there, that time would arrange forgetfulness as it arranged most things. But time, contrary to his belief, was already at work, not to erase, but to teach. Months would pass before he understood the measure of what had occurred, and years before he accepted its meaning. For now, there was only the echo of a voice that had declined him without speaking, the memory of a bow that closed a door he had assumed would always remain open. As she crossed the threshold into a life unclaimed by his title, he stood still, realizing too late that the power to refuse had never been his alone, and that in losing her silence he had awakened his own. Regret grew slowly within him as silence educated his heart beyond inherited power alone. Regret grew slowly within him as silence educated his heart beyond inherited power alone. Regret grew slowly within him as silence educated his heart beyond inherited power alone. Regret grew slowly within him as silence educated his heart beyond inherited power alone. Regret grew slowly within him as silence educated his heart beyond inherited power alone. Regret grew slowly within him as silence educated his heart beyond inherited power alone. Regret grew slowly within him as silence educated his heart beyond inherited power alone. Regret grew slowly within him as silence educated his heart beyond inherited power alone. Regret grew slowly within him as silence educated his heart beyond inherited power alone. Regret grew slowly within him as silence educated his heart beyond inherited power alone. The day after the wedding collapsed, the city spoke with a single mouth, and its judgment arrived swifter than truth. Names were repeated until they lost shape, motives were assigned without witness, and a woman's silence was mistaken for consent. What had ended in restraint now flowered into spectacle, and the tragedy was not that she was rejected, but that the world felt entitled to explain why. It hung the moment like a verdict, stripping complexity from grief and replacing it with certainty that sounded moral and felt convenient to those untouched by its cost or its long shadow afterward. He returned to his houses as though routine could absorb consequence, but the rooms seemed to shrink around him, their quiet accusatory. Servants measured his steps, friends measured his tone, and counselors measured his future against the weight of precedent. He spoke of necessity, and they nodded, pleased to hear the language they had taught. Yet when he was alone, the words refused him, turning back upon their speaker until resolve felt indistinguishable from cowardice and duty from evasion. He learned how echoes outlast applause, and how absence can occupy more space than presence ever dared. There was no rest. She traveled north without announcement, carrying little beyond letters she would not send and a resolve that did not require permission. Distance did not erase memory, but it softened the noise that had mistaken her grace for submission. In quieter days, work replaced watchfulness, and habit replaced anticipation. She rose early, learned names that answered back, and found that self-respect thrives when no audience is present. If pain persisted, it did so without humiliation, and that difference mattered. She discovered a strength that had been waiting for room to breathe, and she guarded it carefully from explanation or display. Between them, objects began to carry weight. A ring rested where light could reach it, untouched and accusing. An heirloom brooch was returned without note, its journey saying what politeness would not. He drafted letters with care and burned them with greater, afraid that explanation might sound like excuse. She read rumors that reached even the fields, learning how distance fails to protect a woman from interpretation. Yet each token clarified what speech obscured, their bond now existed only as evidence. It could be handled, weighed, and misread by others, but never lived again as promise between them. Alone. Unresolved. Society did not tire of the story, it refined it. Dinners rehearsed versions that excused power, and salons praised prudence as virtue. Some blamed her ambition, others her blood, none their appetite for certainty. He heard her name spoken with sympathy that asked nothing of him, and it stung. She learned how quickly sympathy turns conditional when a woman refuses to be rescued. The scandal did not break her, it revealed the price others paid to keep their order intact. He sensed the architecture of that order closing around him, protective and airless, demanding gratitude for its shelter. He hesitated. Time altered the emphasis of their thoughts. For her, loss became instruction, teaching her what she would not trade. For him, success lost its flavor, as though achievement required an audience that had withdrawn. He found himself attentive to small failures, the kind that pass unnoticed until conscience learns to speak. She noticed how choice accumulates, how each refusal strengthens the next. Their paths diverged, yet the line between them remained taut, as if awaiting a hand brave enough to test it. Neither knew what would snap first, nor who would bear the sound. Patience became its own trial. Quietly. A message reached him without signature, reporting her well-being with an economy that felt merciful. It spoke of steadiness, of usefulness, of days that ended without apology. He read it as one reads news of weather, relieved and displaced. She, meanwhile, received an offer to restore her standing, quietly arranged through his influence. It would cost her nothing but return. She understood the gesture as both kindness and claim, and she waited, choosing not to answer at once. Delay became her language, and in it she heard herself clearly for the first time since the church. Freedom argued softly. Within. He began to suspect that repair cannot be managed from afar. Authority had taught him to delegate consequence, but regret resisted that method. He imagined her life without his name attached, and the image did not collapse. This disturbed him more than loss. If she could be whole without him, then his power had limits. He considered movement as speech, a journey as apology unframed. The idea took hold, unwelcome and necessary. It threatened his habits, his counsel, and the safety of distance. Still, it grew, fed by silence and the knowledge that avoidance is also a choice. Always. Costly. She felt the approach before news arrived, a shift in attention that made waiting heavy. Old instincts warned her to prepare defense, but practice had taught her another skill. She let uncertainty stand, trusting what she had built. If he came, it would not be to resume, but to reckon. That difference steadied her. She would not trade peace for repair, nor accept honor that required forgetting. The future stood close, unnamed, and watchful. She resolved to listen fully, and to answer only what was asked. Restraint had become her strength, and strength her safeguard. Nothing else would suffice. Now. He set out with no announcement, carrying no argument that might betray him. What he sought was not forgiveness prearranged, but truth spoken in its proper place. As the distance narrowed, his certainty thinned, leaving him with only the knowledge that presence would change what silence had kept intact. Some changes repair, others expose. He could not know which awaited him, only that the answer belonged to her. In that uncertainty, the conflict found its edge, sharpened by hope and fear, and by a question he had never been forced to ask before: who he was without her consent. Alone. The meeting broke the stillness like a fault reopening beneath memory, and the weight of what had been refused returned with interest. He spoke first, not with apology practiced, but with a truth unarmored, admitting fear had guided him where love might have. She listened without softening, because mercy unearned injures both giver and receiver. In that admission, tragedy shifted, no longer public, now shared between two consciences that refused to look away from consequence. Silence followed, thick with unsaid years and questions that could not be answered by rank or resolve alone. The moment demanded courage, and neither retreated. He confessed the architecture of pressure, counsels murmuring caution, allies praising restraint, the mathematics of reputation taught as virtue. He named the precise instant he chose safety over fidelity, and how the choice hardened into habit. She answered without cruelty, saying she had believed him capable of courage, and that belief had been the true dowry she lost. Her words neither accused nor consoled, they clarified the cost of choosing late. He received them as sentence, understanding that explanation cannot reverse injury, only acknowledge it with honesty and restraint, which he was still learning to practice without reward or excuse. She described the leaving, not as escape, but as discipline, a daily refusal to be explained. Work had taught her proportion, showing how effort restores dignity when titles fail. She spoke of mornings that asked nothing and evenings that closed without applause, and he heard a steadiness that frightened him. He had assumed his absence would wound, instead, it had instructed. This knowledge unsettled his sense of importance, revealing limits where he expected influence. She admitted pain remained, but not humiliation, and that distinction had become her measure of freedom. He nodded, recognizing a standard he had never been asked. He offered restitution carefully, not as bargain, but as repair, influence used publicly, acknowledgement spoken plainly, protection extended without claim. She weighed the offer with practiced calm, knowing how generosity can bind when gratitude is expected. She asked whether his repentance required her return, and the question exposed the hinge of their fate. He answered slowly, saying no gift should purchase her future, and that repair must end where her consent begins. The words surprised him, and she noted the cost they exacted. A boundary appeared, fragile yet decisive, and both understood it would not be crossed without consequence again. Memory pressed forward, and he admitted the instant he looked away at the altar, fearing what her eyes might ask of him. She replied that she had learned to speak without sound, and that refusal had been her first true sentence. Between them, the past narrowed to a single decision, stripped of pageantry and defended only by fear. He asked what she wanted now, and the question trembled, risking rejection without ceremony. She said she wanted continuity, not restoration, a life that would not require erasure to continue. He heard the verdict forming, and felt relief fail him. Respect remained. The conversation slowed, acquiring gravity through restraint. He realized confession is not courage unless it risks denial. She recognized that listening can be an act of sovereignty. They spoke of time not as healer, but as witness, recording who chooses what when no audience applauds. He asked if he might remain in her regard without claim. She paused, measuring sincerity against pattern, and said regard survives honesty, but not expectation. The answer shifted the ground beneath him, demanding patience where he had practiced command. He accepted the terms silently, learning that restraint can be a form of fidelity. For now. When the exchange ended, nothing had been settled, yet something had moved. He understood that repair requires presence without demand, and that leaving might be the truest proof of care. She recognized the strength of having been chosen by herself first. Words had been exchanged, but authority had shifted, relocating from title to consent. He felt the old reflex to promise, and resisted it, honoring the boundary he had named. She felt the old ache to forgive, and set it aside, trusting the discipline that had saved her. The moment concluded without resolution, yet with clarity to alter their futures. Afterward, he prepared to depart without ceremony, carrying the discipline of not asking for more. She acknowledged the leaving as necessary, refusing to dress courage as romance. He offered one final truth, that he would act publicly to correct the harm, regardless of her return. She accepted that intention, naming it justice, not courtship. Their understanding rested there, austere and exacting. As he turned, he realized the hardest labor remained, to change without being witnessed. She remained, measuring the quiet left behind, and found it steady. The path forward required patience equal to courage, and she possessed both without display. The shift was subtle, but decisive. He left without absolution, and she stayed without bitterness. This balance unsettled him, because it denied the drama that excuses inaction. It steadied her, because it affirmed the life she had chosen. Their conflict did not dissolve, it refined, exchanging spectacle for accountability. He carried forward a promise to speak plainly, while she carried forward the right to refuse persuasion. Each step widened the space where truth could stand without defense. The future waited, impartial, prepared to test whether repentance endures when desire is denied. Neither could claim victory, both had learned. Before parting, she said one thing, quiet and exacting, that if he returned, it must be changed, not hopeful. He received the condition as compass rather than door. The tragedy that began with refusal had arrived at choice, and choice now belonged to her. As he departed, uncertainty tightened, not with fear, but with responsibility. She remained steady, knowing the next movement would test whether his repentance could survive distance, delay, and the absence of reward. The conflict sharpened, awaiting proof that words spoken can govern actions repeated. She did not look back, the future would answer him, or not. The declaration did not arrive as hope but as reckoning, and its weight bent the moment toward truth rather than comfort. He returned changed in posture if not in title, carrying action instead of appeal, and the shift unsettled the careful balance they had forged. There was no flourish in his presence, only the gravity of intent refined by restraint. What he brought was not a request for her future, but an accounting of his past, delivered without ornament and without defense. Tragedy, stripped of spectacle, stood between them, asking not for pity, but for judgment measured and final. He spoke of what he had done since leaving, of names spoken publicly where silence once protected him, of influence spent without return. Reputation, he said, had been corrected where possible, not as charity, but as obligation owed. He had learned how swiftly power evaporates when used for repair rather than preservation, and how resistance reveals itself when justice threatens comfort. He did not exaggerate his virtue, nor minimize his delay. Each sentence was offered as record, not persuasion. She listened, attentive yet guarded, aware that proof alters the shape of remorse but does not erase memory. The ledger had grown, but the balance remained uncertain. She responded with precision, acknowledging the work without granting absolution. Restoration of name, she said, cannot restore time, and safety once withdrawn leaves a permanent mark. She had not asked him to change the world, only to recognize the cost of belonging to it. His actions mattered, but their meaning belonged to her. The distinction settled heavily, reminding him that justice is not transaction. He accepted this without protest, realizing that acceptance without reward is the clearest sign of change. In that acceptance, something rigid in him loosened, and something firm in her steadied further. The conversation turned toward consequence, where declarations must prove their endurance. He said he would continue regardless of her answer, because repair incomplete remains duty unfinished. The words carried risk, for they removed leverage from desire. She noted this, and for the first time since the church, she felt the faintest easing of vigilance. Yet ease did not become invitation. She had learned how hope can be conscripted, and she would not lend it again without consent fully earned. The distance between them narrowed not by promise, but by principle, and that narrowing frightened them both. He then offered what he had withheld before, choice unburdened by expectation. If she wished to remain apart, he would not pursue proximity disguised as patience. If she wished to speak again, it would be on terms she named. The declaration landed without romance, but with respect that carried its own severity. She recognized the courage required to release outcome, and the humility of naming limits. Still, she did not answer at once. Silence had become her instrument, tuned to detect sincerity. She allowed it to stretch, not as punishment, but as proof that urgency would not rush her. Memory intruded, uninvited yet necessary. She recalled the altar, the restraint that had spared her spectacle, the strength that had carried her beyond it. She had built a life where dignity was not conditional, where days closed without apology. To re-enter any orbit shaped by his name would test that architecture. She voiced this plainly, refusing to soften the risk. He heard the cost and did not diminish it, saying only that he would not ask her to dismantle what had saved her. The words rang with restraint learned too late, but learned nonetheless. The declaration reached its edge when he acknowledged what could not be offered, certainty. He could promise action, accountability, and continued repair, but not immunity from future pressure. The world that had shaped him remained intact, and he would be tested again. She received this honesty with measured relief, preferring truth to assurance that would collapse under strain. Their exchange became less about reunion than alignment, less about romance than ethics. Tragedy lingered, not as despair, but as awareness that love does not exempt one from consequence. They stood within that awareness, neither retreating nor advancing. She spoke then of resolution as boundary, not closure. There would be no return to what had been imagined, no public reconciliation to soothe observers. If anything endured, it would do so without spectacle, growing only if sustained by consistency rather than declaration. He accepted this resolution, naming it just. The acceptance marked a turning, for it asked him to live without narrative redemption. She felt the weight lift slightly, knowing she had not been persuaded by eloquence, but guided by principle. The shift did not promise happiness, it promised coherence, and that was enough. As the meeting drew toward its end, the air between them felt altered, charged not with longing, but with clarity. He did not ask for permission to hope, and she did not forbid it. The space left unspoken became the truest measure of their progress. He prepared to leave again, understanding that presence can wound when it outpaces trust. She acknowledged his departure without ceremony, recognizing that restraint now served them both. The tragedy that had once been public had become private work, exacting and slow, and neither mistook that labor for romance. Before he turned away, he offered one final statement, quiet and irrevocable, that he would not seek her consent through time alone, but through consistency observable and unannounced. She received this not as vow, but as standard. It bound him without binding her, and that distinction mattered. The future, once framed as recovery, now presented itself as test. She did not answer with hope or refusal, only with acknowledgement. The declaration had been made, the resolution named, yet the outcome remained unwritten. He departed carrying less certainty and more responsibility than he had ever known. She remained carrying autonomy sharpened by trial. The movement between them had shifted from collision to alignment, fragile and exacting. As the silence closed behind him, the conflict did not dissolve, it concentrated, waiting to see whether change endures when no witness applauds and no reunion rewards. The question hovered, unvoiced yet insistent, tying back to the first refusal with relentless symmetry, whether duty can finally learn to serve love without consuming it, or whether restraint itself will become their final truth. The ending arrived not as closure but as consequence, and its force was quieter than anyone expected. Time had done what spectacle could not, wearing away certainty until only character remained. He had continued as promised, repairing what could be repaired, speaking where silence once protected him, choosing difficulty over ease even when no one watched. She had continued too, cultivating a life that did not wait for permission, a life shaped by steadiness rather than vindication. Their stories moved forward in parallel, no longer colliding, yet never fully separate, bound by a decision that had altered them both beyond reversal. The world noticed changes without understanding their origin. His name regained polish in some rooms and lost favor in others, and he accepted both as payment rather than injustice. Influence used honestly proved costly, and he learned how few alliances survive accountability. Yet he did not retreat. He discovered that action repeated becomes identity, and that reputation earned slowly withstands the weather better than reputation defended loudly. In this, he found a stern satisfaction, uncelebrated but real. The absence of her consent remained, not as punishment, but as reminder of the cost of delay. She became known not through restoration, but through reliability. People trusted her judgment, sought her counsel, learned her boundaries. The life she had built grew roots deep enough to resist sudden change. She did not speak of the past unless asked, and even then she spoke without bitterness. Pain had not vanished, it had been integrated, given purpose through restraint. She learned that dignity, once claimed, requires maintenance rather than defense. Her strength did not announce itself, but it endured, and that endurance became its own quiet authority. They did not meet often, and when they did, it was without ceremony. Each encounter confirmed what had already been learned, that affection can exist without entitlement, and regard without possession. He did not ask for what he had once assumed, and she did not offer what had once been expected. Their exchanges were measured, exacting, and honest, shaped by mutual respect rather than hope. The restraint that had once been imposed now felt chosen, and in that choice, tragedy lost its sting without losing its meaning. Yet resolution is never complete, only sufficient for the moment. The question of what might have been lingered, not as torment, but as instruction. He understood now that love withheld by fear becomes a lesson rather than a refuge. She understood that walking away had not been an ending, but a beginning shaped by self-trust. Each carried the memory differently, but neither wished it erased. The past had become teacher rather than judge, and they listened to it without flinching. One evening, news reached her that his efforts had finally succeeded where it mattered most, correcting a public wrong that could not be undone but could be acknowledged. The action carried risk, and cost him dearly in standing. She read the account without triumph, feeling instead a solemn recognition. Change had endured beyond desire. It had become habit. She did not rush to respond, but she did not turn away from the knowledge either. Respect, once fractured, had been rebuilt without demand. He learned of her reaction indirectly, through the absence of withdrawal. The silence felt different now, less guarded, more spacious. He did not mistake it for invitation, but he allowed himself to acknowledge hope without pursuing it. The discipline he had learned held. He remained where he was, choosing consistency over momentum, understanding that some outcomes must be left untouched to retain their integrity. This restraint, once his failure, had become his proof. Their lives continued, intersecting occasionally, shaping each other without ownership. The world, impatient with subtlety, sought clearer endings, but none were offered. No reconciliation satisfied the crowd, no estrangement fed its appetite. What endured was less visible and therefore more honest. The tragedy that had opened their story did not demand a grand correction. It demanded accountability, patience, and the courage to accept limits. In time, she was offered a path that would take her far from what she had built, promising recognition and comfort in exchange for proximity to power. She considered it carefully, measuring opportunity against autonomy. The decision would reshape her future, and indirectly, his. She sought no counsel from him, but she weighed what she had learned through their shared history. Freedom, she knew, is preserved not by avoidance, but by choice made with eyes open. The moment required decision, and she did not rush it. He, meanwhile, faced a test of his own, one that would reveal whether his transformation held under pressure familiar and seductive. Old alliances beckoned, offering restoration without cost. Acceptance would erase the discomfort he had learned to endure. Refusal would confirm his change beyond doubt. The symmetry was unmistakable. The conflict that had once belonged to her now returned to him, asking whether he would choose differently when given the chance. They stood, unknowingly, at parallel thresholds, each shaped by the same history, each responsible for a future no longer defined by the other. The tragedy that had bound them had done its work, refining rather than destroying. Whatever followed would not redeem the past, but it would honor it. The story did not close with union or loss, but with choice sharpened by consequence. As she prepared to answer the offer before her, and he prepared to answer the test before him, the silence between them held, not empty, but expectant. It was the same silence that had once condemned them, now transformed into space for integrity. The final outcome remained unwritten, suspended between restraint and courage, and the question lingered, steady and unresolved, asking not whether love would return, but whether both had learned enough to deserve whatever future they chose next.